Imagine standing at the edge of the world, where the air is so thin your lungs burn with each breath, where mountains pierce the clouds like the broken teeth of sleeping giants, and where entire kingdoms exist above the realm where eagles dare to fly. This is the roof of the world, the Himalayas, Tibet. A land so remote, so impossibly high, that for centuries it remained hidden from history itself, a place of mystery, poetry, and secrets kept by the wind. Tonight, we're going on a journey together. We'll travel through 300 years of history in one of Earth's most extraordinary places, a land where warrior poets ruled from palaces carved into mountainsides, where monks guarded libraries of ancient wisdom, where empires schemed and clashed, and where ordinary people lived extraordinary lives in the shadow of the highest peaks on the planet. Close your eyes now, and let yourself drift upward through clouds and thin air, until you can see what few outsiders saw for centuries, the forbidden kingdom of Tibet in the year 1700, when the modern world as we know it was just beginning to take shape. While Europe buzzed with the Enlightenment and empires rose and fell across distant continents, something remarkable was unfolding in these high places. The fifth Dalai Lama had recently passed away, leaving behind a legacy that would reshape Tibetan society forever. His regent, Sanji Gyatso, had hidden the Dalai Lama's death for 15 years, continuing to rule in his name. This wasn't deception in the way we might imagine it today. It was a careful act of preservation, protecting the stability of a society built on faith and tradition. When the sixth Dalai Lama was finally enthroned in 1697, he was unlike any spiritual leader Tibet had known before. Imagine this young man, Sangyang Gyatso, standing in the Potala Palace. The massive structure rose 13 stories above Lhasa, its white and red walls gleaming in the crystalline mountain air. But this Dalai Lama didn't want to be confined within those walls. He wrote poetry that spoke of earthly love, of wandering the streets at night, of the tension between spiritual duty and human desire. One of his poems whispers across the centuries, "I dwell apart in Potala, a god on earth am I. But down in Lhasa's streets, I am the dissolute Sangyang Gyatso." His reign was brief and turbulent. The Mongols, who had their own designs on Tibet, disapproved of his unconventional ways. By 1706, he had disappeared during a journey to China, his fate uncertain. Some say he died. Others believe he lived on as a wandering monk, freed from the gilded cage of his position. The 18th century brought Tibet into an intricate dance of power between the Qing dynasty in China and various Mongol factions. The Qing Emperor Kangxi, one of the longest-reigning monarchs in Chinese history, saw Tibet as crucial to securing his empire's western frontier. But this wasn't simple conquest. The relationship between Tibet and the Qing was complex, layered with religious significance, political maneuvering, and mutual benefit. In 1720, Qing forces entered Lhasa, not as conquerors, but officially as protectors, invited to expel a Mongol army that had invaded Tibet. They installed the seventh Dalai Lama, a young man found in eastern Tibet, whose gentle nature would earn him great respect. The Qing established representatives called Ambans in Lhasa, but Tibet retained substantial autonomy in its internal affairs. During these decades, life in the Himalayan valleys followed rhythms unchanged for generations. Monasteries dotted the landscape like jewels, some perched impossibly on cliff faces, others sprawling across valley floors. Monks rose before dawn for prayer, their deep chants resonating through halls lit by butter lamps. The smell of juniper incense mixed with the thin, cold air. Trade caravans moved through high passes, carrying salt from the northern lakes, wool from highland sheep, and tea from China. These traders were hardy souls who knew every mountain path, every place where bandits might lurk, every shrine where they should stop to make offerings for safe passage. They told stories around campfires, stories that traveled as far as the goods they carried. In the southern reaches of the Himalayas, where the mountains descend toward the Indian plains, small kingdoms maintained their independence. Sikkim, Bhutan, Nepal, each had its own character, its own relationship with Tibet and its powerful neighbors. The Kingdom of Nepal, unified by Prithvi Narayan Shah in 1768, would soon become a significant player in Himalayan politics. As the 18th century drew to a close, Tibet seemed stable, a land apart from the rapid changes sweeping other parts of the world. The Qing presence was light, the Dalai Lama's religious authority unquestioned, and the rhythms of monastic and nomadic life continued as they had for centuries. But change, as always, was approaching from unexpected directions. Let your breathing slow now, in rhythm with those ancient chants, as we prepare to move forward through time. Breathe deeply, and let us continue our journey through time. The 19th century arrived in the Himalayas not with a bang, but with the quiet accumulation of pressure, like snow building on a mountainside before an avalanche. The British had established themselves in India, their East India Company transforming from traders into rulers. They looked northward at the Himalayan ranges with a mixture of fascination and suspicion. What lay beyond those mountains? Who controlled those heights? And most importantly, could Russia, Britain's great rival in what historians would call the Great Game, reach down through Tibet toward India? In 1792, something unexpected happened. A Nepalese army invaded Tibet, reaching as far as Shigatse, home of the Panchen Lama, the second most important figure in Tibetan Buddhism. They plundered the monasteries, taking jewels and sacred objects. The Tibetans appealed to the Qing emperor, and a Chinese army marched across the high plateau, driving the Nepalese back. This intervention strengthened the Qing presence in Tibet, but it also revealed Tibet's vulnerability. The Qing emperors of this period, particularly Jiaqing and Daoguang, saw Tibet primarily through the lens of frontier management and religious diplomacy. They supported Tibetan Buddhism because it helped maintain order among Mongol populations and provided legitimacy to their rule. But their attention was increasingly drawn elsewhere, to internal rebellions, to the catastrophic Opium Wars with Britain, to the slow unraveling of imperial authority. In Lhasa, life continued with its timeless quality. The Potala Palace overlooked the city like a mountain itself, a mountain built by human hands. Imagine walking through its countless rooms, chapels with walls covered in intricate murals, meditation chambers where generations of monks had sat in silence, storerooms filled with manuscripts written on treated palm leaves or hardy Tibetan paper made from the bark of high-altitude shrubs. But Tibet was beginning its long period of isolation. In 1811, the Qing government, concerned about foreign interference, prohibited foreigners from entering Tibet. This policy would last, with occasional exceptions, until the 20th century. The British in India found their requests to establish trade relations repeatedly denied. A few intrepid explorers and spies, disguised as pilgrims or traders, managed to penetrate the forbidden land, making secret maps and recording observations. One such adventurer was Thomas Manning, who in 1811 became the first Englishman to reach Lhasa. Disguised and traveling with a Chinese merchant, he spent several months in the city. His journals describe the kindness of ordinary Tibetans, the splendor of religious ceremonies, and the curiosity people showed toward this strange foreigner. But he also noted the suspicion of officials, the careful control of information, the sense of a society turning inward. The middle decades of the 19th century saw the rise and fall of several Dalai Lamas. This was a troubling pattern. Young boys would be found and identified as reincarnations, educated and prepared for leadership, only to die mysteriously before reaching their majority. The 9th through 12th Dalai Lamas all died young, some said poisoned by regents who wielded power in their names. The 13th Dalai Lama, born in 1876, would break this pattern, but his story belongs to our next chapter. Meanwhile, the British continued their systematic mapping and study of the Himalayas. The Great Trigonometric Survey of India, begun in 1802, slowly worked its way northward. In 1852, calculations based on observations taken from the Indian plains revealed that a peak known as Peak 15 was the world's tallest mountain. By 1865, it would be named Mount Everest, after Sir George Everest, the survey's superintendent, though local peoples had known this mountain by other names for countless generations, Komolungma in Tibetan, Sagarmatha in Nepali. The survey employed brave individuals called pundits, often people from Himalayan regions who could travel in Tibet without arousing suspicion. They were trained to measure distances by counting their steps with Buddhist rosaries, to determine latitude by observing stars with instruments hidden in prayer wheels, to memorize geographical details that they would later record. These men walked thousands of miles, risking their lives to create the first accurate maps of Tibet. One such pundit, Nain Singh Rawat, made several journeys through Tibet in the 1860s and 1870s. He walked from Leh to Lhasa and beyond, measuring, observing, surviving bandits and blizzards. His reports revealed the geography of the plateau, the routes of trade, the locations of towns and monasteries. For this, the Royal Geographical Society would eventually award him a gold medal, though he remained relatively unknown in his lifetime. In Sikkim and Bhutan, British influence gradually increased through treaties and agreements. In Nepal, the Rana family had seized power in 1846, reducing the monarch to a figurehead and establishing a hereditary prime ministership that would last over a century. The Ranas maintained Nepal's independence through careful diplomacy, playing the British against the Chinese, keeping their kingdom as a buffer state. As the century neared its end, Tibet remained isolated, mysterious, a blank space on maps that fed Western imagination. It was called Shangri-La, the Forbidden Kingdom, a land of mystical wisdom and strange powers. These romantic notions obscured the reality of Tibetan life, the hard work of farming and herding, the complex politics of monasteries and noble families, the genuine spirituality that coexisted with very human concerns about power and survival. Let yourself sink deeper now, as we move toward the 20th century, toward the moment when Tibet's isolation would finally, irrevocably, end. Rest easy now, and journey with me into the 20th century, when the ancient heights of the Himalayas became a stage for modern ambitions. The 13th Dalai Lama, Thubten Gyatso, came of age in 1895, breaking the tragic pattern of his predecessors' early deaths. He was intelligent, politically astute, and deeply concerned about Tibet's future. He could sense the pressure building around his isolated nation, the way a herder senses an approaching storm in the stillness of the air. In 1903, the British Viceroy of India, Lord Curzon, decided that British interests required a more direct relationship with Tibet. He sent Colonel Francis Younghusband to lead a mission to Lhasa, ostensibly to negotiate trade agreements. When the Tibetans, following their policy of isolation, refused to negotiate at the border, Younghusband advanced with a military force. What followed was tragic and deeply uneven. At Chumikshenko, Tibetan soldiers, many armed with prayer wheels and swords, some with antique matchlock guns, faced British troops with modern rifles and machine guns. The British commander ordered his men to hold fire, but when a Tibetan general was killed in a scuffle, chaos erupted. Hundreds of Tibetans died in minutes. The British marched on. In August 1904, Younghusband's expedition reached Lhasa. The Dalai Lama had fled to Mongolia, leaving his officials to negotiate. Younghusband found not a land of magical warriors but a peaceful society unprepared for modern warfare. He sat in the audience halls of the Potala, negotiated a treaty, and departed, leaving behind a British trade representative. The mission achieved little of lasting value, but it shattered Tibet's isolation forever. The Dalai Lama spent years in exile, first in Mongolia, then in Beijing, and finally in India, learning about the modern world and making diplomatic contacts. He returned to Lhasa in 1909, only to flee again in 1910 when Chinese forces invaded, attempting to assert direct control. This time he went south to India, where the British received him with respect. The fall of the Qing dynasty in 1911 changed everything. As revolution consumed China, Chinese troops withdrew from Tibet, and the Dalai Lama returned once more to Lhasa in 1913. He issued a proclamation asserting Tibet's independence, reorganized the army, and attempted to modernize his nation. But Tibet's independence would never gain international recognition, and the Dalai Lama's modernization efforts faced resistance from conservative elements in Tibetan society. Picture the Dalai Lama in the Potala during these years, looking out over the city toward the mountains beyond. He understood that the old ways could not continue unchanged. He established a postal system, introduced paper currency, and sent young Tibetans to be educated in England. But the monastic establishment, which controlled vast wealth and wielded enormous influence, resisted changes that might diminish their power. In 1933, the 13th Dalai Lama died, leaving behind a political testament that warned of threats from the East. It may happen that here, in the center of Tibet, religion and government will be attacked both from without and from within. His prophecy would prove chillingly accurate. The search for his reincarnation led officials to a remote village in Amdo, on Tibet's eastern edge. There they found a 2-year-old boy named Lamo Thondup, who recognized objects belonging to the previous Dalai Lama and displayed signs considered confirmatory of his identity. After complex negotiations and the payment of substantial sums to a local warlord, the boy was brought to Lhasa in 1939. He would become the 14th Dalai Lama, the one who would lead Tibet through its greatest crisis. Meanwhile, beyond Tibet's borders, the world was transforming. The British Raj in India was entering its final decades. The Second World War raged across the globe, though the Himalayas remained largely untouched by direct combat. Nepal maintained its careful neutrality. Sikkim and Bhutan existed as British protectorates, quiet mountain kingdoms where life continued much as it had for generations. In China, civil war between the nationalists and communists had been interrupted by Japanese invasion, only to resume with devastating intensity after 1945. Mao Zedong and the Communist Party, espousing a vision of revolutionary transformation, were gaining the upper hand. In 1947, India achieved independence from Britain, partitioned into India and Pakistan in a process marked by horrific violence. The new Indian government inherited the British position on Tibet, claiming a special relationship but not recognizing Tibetan independence. British influence throughout the Himalayas was ending, replaced by newly independent nations finding their way in a changed world. Tibet, during these years, seemed to exist outside of time. In monasteries, monks debated philosophical points unchanged since the Middle Ages. Nomads moved their herds across the plateau with the seasons. Pilgrims circumambulated holy sites, their prayers mixing with the wind. The young Dalai Lama studied Buddhist philosophy, unaware of how soon he would need to become a statesman rather than merely a scholar. In October 1949, the People's Liberation Army defeated the nationalists, and Mao proclaimed the People's Republic of China. One of the new government's stated goals was to liberate Tibet from imperialist influences and reunite it with the motherland. In Lhasa, officials debated desperately about how to respond, but Tibet had no army capable of resisting, no international allies willing to intervene, no way to prevent what was coming. Let your thoughts drift now, like prayer flags on the mountain wind, as we move into the most turbulent period of Himalayan history. Breathe slowly, and settle into this part of our story, where ancient ways collide with revolutionary fervor, where the peaceful heights witness profound transformation. In October 1950, the People's Liberation Army crossed into eastern Tibet. The Tibetan army, numbering only a few thousand poorly equipped soldiers, was quickly overwhelmed. The government in Lhasa turned to the United Nations, to Britain, to the United States, to India, but no help came. The world was preoccupied with the Korean War, with Cold War tensions, with recovering from the devastation of World War II. In November 1950, the young Dalai Lama, just 15 years old, was granted full temporal authority years ahead of schedule. Imagine this teenager, plucked from obscurity as a child, now responsible for navigating an impossible situation. He was advised by older officials, some favoring accommodation, others resistance. In the end, there was little choice. In May 1951, Tibetan representatives in Beijing signed the 17-point agreement, which acknowledged Chinese sovereignty over Tibet while promising to preserve Tibetan autonomy, religious freedom, and the Dalai Lama's position. The Dalai Lama, after much deliberation, accepted the agreement, hoping that cooperation might preserve some essence of Tibetan identity. For several years, an uneasy coexistence prevailed in central Tibet. Chinese officials and troops arrived in Lhasa, bringing roads, schools, and hospitals, but also bringing political indoctrination and increasing control. In eastern regions of Tibet, where Chinese authority was more aggressively implemented, resistance began to form. The Khampas, fierce people from eastern Tibet known for their warrior traditions, organized armed resistance. Supported covertly by the CIA, which saw an opportunity to harass Communist China, these fighters waged guerrilla war against Chinese forces. But they were no match for the People's Liberation Army, and their resistance, while brave, achieved little beyond demonstrating that Tibetans would not submit willingly. The Dalai Lama during these years walked an impossible tightrope. He traveled to Beijing in 1954, meeting Mao Zedong and other Chinese leaders. Mao spoke to him of modernization, of freeing Tibet from feudalism, of the bright communist future. The Dalai Lama listened, tried to find common ground, hoped that patience and negotiation might preserve his people's way of life. But in 1959, everything unraveled. Tensions in Lhasa had been building for months. Rumors spread that the Chinese planned to arrest the Dalai Lama. On March 10, tens of thousands of Tibetans surrounded the Norbulinka, the Dalai Lama's summer palace, determined to protect him. For days, the situation grew more volatile. Then Chinese artillery began shelling the palace and the city. On March 17, disguised as a soldier, the Dalai Lama slipped out of the Norbulinka under cover of darkness. Accompanied by family, advisors, and guards, he began a harrowing journey across the Himalayas toward India. They traveled by night, avoiding Chinese patrols, crossing high passes where the air burned in their lungs and the cold bit through their clothes. After 2 weeks, they crossed into India on March 31, 1959. The Indian government, led by Prime Minister Jawaharlal Nehru, granted asylum to the Dalai Lama and the tens of thousands of Tibetan refugees who followed him. The Dalai Lama established a government in exile in Dharamsala, a hill station in northern India, where it remains today. Back in Tibet, the aftermath of the uprising was severe. Thousands died in the fighting and subsequent reprisals. Monasteries were closed, monks and nuns forced to return to lay life, religious practices restricted. The Chinese government began implementing socialist policies more aggressively: collectivization, class struggle campaigns, transformation of traditional society. Then came the Cultural Revolution, beginning in 1966. Across China, Red Guards, zealous young revolutionaries, targeted anything old, traditional, or religious as counter-revolutionary. In Tibet, the destruction was catastrophic. Of the thousands of monasteries that had stood for centuries, only a handful survived intact. Religious texts were burned, statues smashed, monks persecuted or killed. Families were forced to denounce each other, traditional culture was suppressed, speaking of the Dalai Lama became dangerous. Yet even in darkness, light persists. In secret, families maintained shrines. Old people taught children prayers in whispers. The memory of what had been remained alive in the hearts of Tibetans, waiting for a time when it might be openly expressed again. Meanwhile, in exile, the Tibetan community began rebuilding. Refugee settlements were established in India, Nepal, and Bhutan. Schools were founded to educate a new generation in both traditional Tibetan subjects and modern knowledge. Monasteries were re-established, preserving the intricate philosophical and ritual traditions that might otherwise have been lost. The Dalai Lama himself transformed during these years. From a sheltered monk king, he became an international figure, traveling the world to speak about Tibet's plight, about Buddhism, about peace and compassion. He studied democracy, eventually reforming the exile government to include elected representatives, attempting to build the democratic society he had never been able to create in Tibet. In the Himalayan kingdoms surrounding Tibet, different trajectories unfolded. Nepal remained independent, though politically unstable, oscillating between democracy and monarchy. In 1975, King Birendra ascended the throne, eventually establishing a constitutional monarchy, though real democracy would take decades more to achieve. Sikkim's fate was different. In 1975, facing internal turmoil and external pressure, Sikkim's monarchy was abolished through a referendum, and the kingdom merged with India, becoming its 22nd state. The ancient palace in Gangtok, capital of Sikkim, became a museum, a reminder of a sovereignty that had ended. Bhutan, the most isolated of the Himalayan kingdoms, maintained its independence through careful diplomacy with India. Under King Jigme Dorji Wangchuck and then his son Jigme Sinji Wangchuck, Bhutan slowly opened to the modern world while attempting to preserve its culture. The concept of gross national happiness emerged, the idea that spiritual and cultural well-being mattered as much as economic development. As the 1970s ended, the Himalayas presented a landscape of contrasts. In Tibet, oppression was slowly easing as China recovered from the Cultural Revolution's madness. In exile, a vibrant Tibetan community maintained its traditions. In the surrounding nations, modernity was arriving in fits and starts, sometimes embraced, sometimes resisted. Rest now in this moment of transition, as we prepare to explore the most recent chapters of our story. Let your mind drift gently forward now, into decades when the Himalayas began opening to the world in ways unimaginable just years before. In China, the death of Mao Zedong in 1976 and the rise of Deng Xiaoping brought profound changes. Deng's pragmatic reforms, "It doesn't matter if a cat is black or white, as long as it catches mice," gradually transformed Chinese society. In Tibet, this meant a relaxation of the most oppressive policies. Monasteries began to reopen, though under state supervision. Some religious practices were again permitted. Tibetans could once more visit the Jokhang Temple in Lhasa, Buddhism's holiest site in Tibet, and prostrate themselves before sacred images. Yet this opening had limits. The Chinese government's position remained firm. Tibet was an integral part of China, the Dalai Lama was a separatist, and any challenge to state authority would not be tolerated. In 1987 and again in 1989, protests in Lhasa were met with violent crackdowns. Martial law was imposed. The world, briefly attentive during the 1989 demonstrations, soon turned its attention to the dramatic events at Tiananmen Square in Beijing. In 1989, the Dalai Lama received the Nobel Peace Prize, recognition of his commitment to nonviolence and dialogue. In his acceptance speech, he spoke not just of Tibet but of universal responsibility, of the interconnectedness of all peoples, of the possibility of resolving conflicts without violence. His message resonated globally, making him one of the world's most recognized spiritual leaders. Through the 1990s, Tibet experienced contradictory trends. The Chinese government invested heavily in infrastructure, roads, airports, eventually a railway connecting Lhasa to the rest of China. Economic development brought rising living standards for many, but also an influx of Han Chinese migrants, changing the demographic and cultural character of Tibetan cities. Modern buildings sprouted alongside ancient structures. Internet cafes appeared in Lhasa. Young Tibetans in cities listened to pop music and watched movies, participating in global youth culture. Yet beneath this surface modernity, tension simmered. Many Tibetans felt their culture was being diluted, their religion constrained, their identity under threat. The contradiction between economic opportunity and cultural preservation created complex feelings, gratitude for material improvements mixed with loss for what was disappearing. In the exile community, the Dalai Lama continued his campaign of what he called the middle way, not seeking independence but genuine autonomy for Tibet within China, where Tibetans could preserve their culture and practice their religion freely. The Chinese government showed little interest in these proposals, viewing them as disguised separatism. Meanwhile, the rest of the Himalayan region was also transforming. Nepal experienced political upheaval in 1990, with mass protests forcing the monarchy to accept constitutional reforms and real democracy. The country held elections, newspapers flourished, civil society emerged. But democracy proved messy and frustrating, with frequent government changes and rampant corruption. Still, it was a democracy, something Nepalis had fought hard to achieve. In 1991, a mountaineering expedition discovered the body of George Mallory on Mount Everest. Mallory had disappeared during a summit attempt in 1924, creating one of mountaineering's great mysteries. Had he and his partner Andrew Irvine reached the summit decades before Edmund Hillary and Tenzing Norgay's confirmed ascent in 1953? The discovery of Mallory's preserved body high on the mountain sparked renewed fascination with Everest and Himalayan climbing. The 1990s saw an explosion in Himalayan tourism and mountaineering. Commercial expeditions made climbing Everest and other peaks accessible to anyone with sufficient money and moderate fitness. Traffic jams formed on popular routes. The mountains that had been the realm of elite climbers and indigenous peoples were now being summited by dozens, even hundreds, each season. This brought economic benefits to Nepal, especially to the Sherpa communities who had long lived in Everest's shadow and who provided the backbone of mountaineering expeditions. But it also brought environmental degradation, cultural disruption, and occasional tragedy when inexperienced climbers died in the thin air above 8,000 meters. Bhutan continued its unique path. In the 1990s, under King Jigme Singye Wangchuk, the country finally allowed television and internet, making it one of the last nations on earth to do so. The king carefully managed modernization, attempting to bring benefits of development while preserving Bhutan's Buddhist culture and environmental heritage. Bhutan became famous for its forests, its carbon-negative status, and its insistence that happiness mattered more than GDP. As the millennium approached, the Himalayas presented a fascinating mosaic. Ancient monasteries now had electricity and cell phone towers nearby. Nomads still moved their herds across high plateaus, but might carry mobile phones to call family members working in distant cities. Buddhist monks studied traditional philosophy in the morning and checked email in the afternoon. The old and new coexisted in sometimes jarring, sometimes harmonious ways. And so we arrive, gently, at our own era, where the ancient and modern continue their intricate dance in these high places. The 21st century began with the Himalayas fully connected to the global world, for better and worse. In 2006, the Qinghai-Tibet Railway opened, connecting Lhasa to the rest of China's rail network. The engineering was remarkable, the highest railway in the world, with pressurized cars to help passengers cope with altitude. Trains crossed permafrost that threatened to melt and undermine the tracks, a problem that foreshadowed climate challenges to come. For China, the railway represented development, progress, national integration. For many Tibetans, it symbolized further loss of isolation and identity, bringing even more Chinese settlers and tourists. The Dalai Lama expressed concerns that Tibet was being swamped, culturally overwhelmed by sheer numbers. In 2008, the year China hosted the Olympics in Beijing, protests erupted across Tibet. Beginning peacefully with monks in Lhasa marking the anniversary of the 1959 uprising, they spread and turned violent in some places. The Chinese government's response was swift and harsh. Foreign journalists and tourists were expelled. The region was locked down. The government blamed the Dalai Lama for orchestrating the unrest. He denied involvement while expressing sympathy for Tibetan frustrations. The Dalai Lama, aging but still active, began preparing for his succession in a unique way. He announced that he might not reincarnate at all, or might choose his successor rather than be discovered as a child. This was partly theological evolution, partly practical politics. He didn't want China selecting a puppet Dalai Lama to control, as they had done with the Panchen Lama years earlier. In 2011, the Dalai Lama formally retired from political leadership of the Tibetan exile government, transferring power to an elected prime minister. This democratization of the exile community was perhaps his most significant political legacy, attempting to ensure Tibetan survival didn't depend on one person. Nepal's story through these decades was turbulent. A Maoist insurgency, beginning in the 1990s, escalated into civil war, killing thousands. In 2001, nearly the entire royal family was killed in a palace massacre, a shocking event whose full truth remains murky. The war ended in 2006 with an agreement bringing the Maoists into democratic politics. In 2008, Nepal's monarchy was abolished after 240 years, and the country became a federal republic. But peace didn't mean stability. Nepal has cycled through numerous governments, struggled with corruption, and grappled with rebuilding after devastating earthquakes in 2015 that killed nearly 9,000 people. Iconic structures in Kathmandu's ancient squares crumbled. Villages in the mountains were leveled. The international community rushed in aid, but recovery has been slow. Bhutan made perhaps the most remarkable transition. In 2008, King Jigme Khesar Namgyel Wangchuk, educated at Oxford, beloved by his people, voluntarily transformed Bhutan from an absolute monarchy to a constitutional monarchy with democratic elections. A king giving up power voluntarily is rare in history, but the Bhutanese monarchy understood that legitimate governance required democratic consent. Climate change is now the Himalayas' most profound challenge. These mountains contain the world's third-largest ice reserves after the poles, feeding rivers that support over 1 billion people in India, China, Pakistan, and Southeast Asia. But glaciers are retreating at alarming rates. Precipitation patterns are shifting. Disasters like glacial lake outburst floods, where meltwater breaks through natural dams, threaten communities downstream. In 2021, a glacier collapse in Uttarakhand, India, sent a wall of water and debris down a valley, killing over 200 people and destroying 2 hydropower projects. Such events, once rare, are becoming more frequent. The stability of these mountains, long taken for granted, can no longer be assumed. Yet life continues in its beautiful, persistent way. Tibetan communities in exile maintain their culture with remarkable vigor. Dharamsala hosts thousands of Tibetan refugees and has become a global center for Tibetan Buddhism study. Young Tibetans born in exile, who have never seen Tibet, keep alive their parents' and grandparents' memories and hopes. In Lhasa today, tourists and pilgrims mingle around the Jokhang Temple. The Potala Palace, now a museum, receives thousands of visitors daily. Tibetan culture persists, adapted to modern constraints. Young people navigate between traditional expectations and modern aspirations, much like youth everywhere. The Himalayas today are a place of contradictions. Of ancient trade routes now traveled by trucks and prayer flags fluttering beside cell towers. Of monasteries where monks debate philosophy unchanged for centuries and then check social media on smartphones. Of cultures under pressure yet also adapting, surviving, even thriving in new forms. As we conclude our journey, imagine once more those impossibly high peaks, eternally draped in snow. The mountains remain, as they have through all these centuries of human drama. They remind us of perspectives beyond our immediate concerns, of timescales that dwarf human lifespans, of beauty that transcends politics and conflict. The story of modern Tibet and the Himalayas is ultimately about resilience, of peoples, cultures, and lands enduring through tremendous change. It's about the tension between preservation and progress, isolation and connection, tradition and modernity. It's a story still unfolding, written daily by millions of people living in and around these extraordinary mountains. Let yourself rest now, in the peace of the high places, where the wind whispers through prayer flags, carrying old blessings into new times. The mountains stand, patient and enduring, as they have always stood, as they will continue to stand long after we all have passed into memory and story. Rest easy, dear listener. Let the story settle gently in your mind as you drift toward sleep, carried on the thin, clear air of the roof of the world.